Hi guys. Today I would like to discuss something that I wrote earlier today about does morality automatically assume religious dogmas and adherence? Why or why not? And in this it's does morality automatically imply being religious, religiosity, etc.? Can we be a moral person without religion? So I often write about morality because morality is something very, very important to me, and not a lot of people, or maybe there's some confusion, or maybe people might think I'm religious because of that. And I'm not dissing religion in this presentation. I'm not religious, but I have been in the past. But I can definitely say that I'm more moral now than I've ever been in my life. And I have more desire to be a moral person and to be more a reasonable person than I ever have in my life. So why do people really kind of get confused, and why do they conflate being moral with religious? Well, up until a certain point, that was the only way, or at least the only external way that people would identify moral people. You're moral, well, you must be religious, because a lot of religious people were also moral people. But did they actually take their morals from their religion, or was it something that they picked up from somewhere else? And what I would like to say is that I think that morality doesn't necessarily come from religion, although religion can have moral fiber and moral codes kind of embedded within it. That religion, or that morality, actually comes from being rational and reasonable, and that we can actually develop our morality because, you know, the opposite of morality is egocentrism. So egocentric people are amoral, they're immoral. They don't have any morals, and therefore they don't have to be reasonable with people. They don't have to act in a reasonable fashion. They can lie, they can steal, they can cheat, they can do whatever, you know, the end justifies the means. To them, that's rational. But actual rationality, true rationality, at least from my perspective, is not egocentric. And the more that you develop yourself as a human being, the more that you work on your own thinking and you work on your rationality and things like that, the more you're going to be a moral person. So I'm going to read something to you from The Miniature Guide to the Human Mind by Linda Elder and Richard Paul from criticalthinking.org. This is a book that you can get off of Amazon. Human rationality is fair-minded and self-developing, while irrationality, or egocentrism, is selfish and self-validating. All irrationality presupposes some degree of unconsciousness in order to function self-deceptively. Most rational thought functions consciously. Because irrationality appears to the mind as reasonable, we must develop strategies for disclosing irrational thought. So this actually is going to take us into the realm of psychology, because to be a rational person, now you have to become conscious and aware of your irrational behaviors and irrational thoughts. And how do you do that? You start, reverse engineering your psyche. You start looking at your thinking. You start looking at what you're feeling in the moment. Carl Jung's shadow work process is all about finding the unconscious shadow. What is the unconscious shadow? Those parts that make us irrational. So the more that we make the unconscious conscious, which is Carl Jung's individuation process, the more rational we're actually becoming. So we're no longer going to be acting in these irrational ways, these egocentric ways, because we are more reasonable, because we've shined the light of consciousness onto the unconscious. So here we see that the rational, that the reasonable, that the logic, and what the mystics would call the logos, the divine reason, which is logic pointed inwards. Instead of pointing the logic out there and trying to use it to control people, it's pointing it inwards so that we can become aligned and then be creative force in the world. When we shine the light of consciousness on the unconscious, when we align ourselves, we become more creative, become more conscious and aware, we become more rational, we become less egocentric, less irrational, and thus we're all more moral. So morality is we're not harming other people because we're reasonable people. Reasonable people have logic. Unreasonable people, such as psychopaths, such as people that are dumbed down from society because of have had their thinking dulled. They are immoral because they don't know how to think through the consequences of their actions. If I can look at myself and say, what are the consequences of my behaviors? and where are my behaviors coming from? Why am I feeling this way? Why am I thinking this? Why, did I have that crazy thought just now about wanting to hurt somebody? If you could start reverse engineering that, you can actually use logic and reason turned inwards to deconstruct those crazy thoughts that we have and become more rational as a person. So instead of just suppressing it and saying, oh, that was an irrational thought, let me just kind of stuff that down there. I don't want to think about that anymore. Pretend that I didn't actually think that. I'm a really good person. Well, no, that's a shadow. That's an irrational thing that you're thinking, and why was your mind doing that? And so we just have to kind of go in there, deconstruct that with logic, pointed inwards to become more rational, more reasonable, less egocentric, more moral. Hopefully this helped you to understand why I asked the question earlier about religion, and that I think that there is an objective way to actually become a moral person with objective standards. And that those objective standards are rationality and reason. But it's not rationality and reason pointed outwards, it's rationality and reason pointed inwards. Have a good one. Hi guys. Today's discussion, I'm going to talk about arbitrary accountability versus objective accountability, and what the difference is, and why we even need to differentiate the two types and forms of accountability, and why that's important. I'm going to wait for just a second before I really get going here. Okay, so the reason why I think this is important, I'm actually having technical difficulties here, so hold on. Okay, it looks like the technical difficulties were over on my camera. Something was, I had to close something on my computer because it was going really slow. Okay, so on arbitrary accountability versus objective accountability, let's just look at accountability first. Accountability means that you're open to being responsible for your thoughts, feelings, or behaviors, for the experiences in your life. You're willing to be accountable. Hi, Ernea. How are you doing? No big deal. So when we're accountable, like somebody says, hey, I'm going to hold you accountable for something. Can you take responsibility, personal responsibility for such and such? So if you have a disagreement, if one person feels wronged by the other, then you can hold them accountable for their poor behavior. And that's important. Our ability to be responsible and to take responsibility over our lives is really important. Unfortunately, often we do this because of guilt or shame or some other reason. And that's because we are practicing arbitrary accountability and not objective accountability. So arbitrary, I'll look at the word here. Arbitrary means based on a random choice or personal whim rather than any reason or system. So it's an arbitrary decision, an arbitrary behavior. It's very subjective. But an objective accountability is where you're willing to be accountable to things that are objectively true. So instead of it just being based on this person's whims and how they're feeling in that moment, and whatever chaos is going on right now, you're going to actually be accountable for only objective things. So we have a big mix of this though in our life. So like arbitrary accountability, for example, we learn this as children when our parents come home from school or come home from work. We come home from school, they had a bad day at work, and then they kick the dog, so to speak. And so they are very upset about something. They're unconscious about that upset. Rather than taking ownership of that upset, now they make it on you, and now you have to be accountable. So it's arbitrary. They're getting upset at us because of their bad day, and we're trying to, so they're like, don't you do that. And so they, they take a small little thing that you did and they make it this giant thing. So it's not rational how out of proportion they have taken this little tiny thing that you did as a child. So they're not, they're being very arbitrary and holding you accountable. And in fact, they're the ones who need to be held accountable, but because you're a child, you can't really hold your parents accountable because they're bigger than you. And so this is kind of where we learn arbitrary accountability. Another thing, so like, you have taxes, you have be a good citizen, you have to follow these rules that were democratically voted on by the majority. or paid off by, you know, a banker or something like that. You have a school system, you know, go to school every day and do your homework every day. And if you question us, then you're going to get in trouble. But this is arbitrary. It's not, it might seem like there's some kind of a reason that they've, you know, rational way, but that's a defense mechanism like we learned yesterday. So these defense mechanisms come in and say they rationalize away these arbitrary reasons. The real reason for, you know, public schooling is to create uniformity and conformity and to mold your mind into an obedient person. It's actually making you, patterning you to be arbitrarily accountable for arbitrary things. One of the problems I had when I was dating before I met Aline was that there was a lot of times women would try to arbitrarily hold me accountable for something. Don't do this because it feels bad. You know, I had a, you know, maybe their hormones are messed up that day, or maybe they're just kind of being irrational. Now, it could have been, you know, if I was a woman, men could be the same way. So I'm not saying that it's predominantly male or female, but it's just like, you know, for me, I'm a man, so this is my experience. So when dating women, they would be arbitrarily like in these weird moods, and then they would try to hold you accountable based on their weird moods or based on their beliefs that they, you know, came up with from childhood, or, you know, what society's telling them. So right now you have a whole bunch of arbitrary stuff like, oh, now you have white privilege. And now we're supposed to be accountable for this arbitrary thing called white privilege, which isn't actually even a scientific thing. It's just made up. It's made up jargon. And it's not objective in any way, but I have to feel guilty because I'm white and I'm a male, and now I have to start giving up all my stuff to this arbitrary thing. And I don't need to be accountable for that. Now, when you look at objective accountability, this is what I do with sessions. This is what I do with asking questions. So if I say, can you please be more clear? Can you clarify this point? Is this what you're saying? Boom. I just held you accountable when it came to clarity, because clarity is an objective logical standard. If I ask, can you be more precise? I'm not really understanding what you're saying. Can you be more precise? How is that relevant to this discussion? Boom, I just held you accountable. I'm using questions to hold you accountable. Now, is it me holding you accountable, or is it an objective standard holding you accountable? Like, I don't have to be accountable to you. Well, this isn't me you're being accountable to. This is just objective standards. I'm merely being the vehicle asking the questions. Yeah, it's a learned behavior for sure, Yurnea. So we can start taking things like, and I have here the 8 intellectual character traits and intellectual standards. When you look at it, it's clarity, accuracy, precision, relevance, depth, breadth, logic, and fairness. So in all these things, these are objective standards that we can apply to ourselves. So I apply this to my thinking. I'm like, oh, okay, was what I wrote just clear? Was what I wrote accurate? Was it precise? Was it actually relevant? Did everything actually make sense? Is it relevant? Is there depth to this? Am I getting good enough depth in my explanation? Is it breadth? Is it wide enough? Is it logical enough? And is it fair? Am I being fair-minded? Am I considering other opinions as well in this? So these are all objective standards that transcend me as a person. So I apply this to myself, and as a result, I also apply it to people that I interact with. I do it with my clients. I do it with my partner. I do it with my children. I do it with my animals. These are, and animals is going to be a little different because I'm not asking for clarity from an animal, but I'm holding to me to those standards when I'm interacting with others, including my animals. Michelle, wow, this was on my mind this morning already. Synchronicity, thank you for sharing this topic. You're welcome, Michelle. So when we are able to be accountable for these areas of our life, and then we start really kind of doing this with Aline. This is what I really love about Aline and our relationship together, is we're always hammering on this accountability. And it's not that she has to be accountable to me as a man. She doesn't have to be accountable to me as a person. She has to be accountable to the truth. And the truth are these standards that we place on ourselves. Is it logical? Is it fair? Is it accurate? Is it precise? And we're always asking each other questions. Now, I ran into a couple that was a leadership couple, and I just asked them some questions to be more clear. But they didn't feel like they had to be clear with me. And I wasn't being a jerk about it. I just, can you please explain this? I'm not understanding. Is this what you're saying? Is this what I understand? And is this what you're saying? And they wouldn't actually answer that. And so they were resistant to subjective standards, and then they were conflating it with objective standards or accountability. So they wouldn't be accountable subjectively, but they also wouldn't be accountable objectively. So as somebody, I'm fine being, I can see the difference. So I'm fine being accountable to anybody if it's objective. I don't care who you are. I don't care what kind of, anything. If you're being objective and you hold me to a standard and you ask for clarity, I'm going to answer. Because I'm fine with that. It's not about me. It's in the Gospels, especially the Gnostic Gospels, Jesus is known as the Logos. The Logos is the divine logic of God. He's the reason. He's a personification of the divine Logos. What that means is he's literally channeling this divine logic through him. He's aligned himself to that extent that he is now one with this logic. And this is where free will actually begins. So he is placing these standards on people through, asking them questions or whatever, teaching them these kinds of things. And this is what we also would aim to do. And so if I'm going to surrender to something, I'm not going to surrender to somebody's arbitrary feeling, because it's based on them. It's based on their ego. It's based on their feelings. It's based on them. I'm going to be accountable only to God. What is God? God is reason. God is the Logos. God is this objective accountability. I'm only going to be accountable to objectivity, to the Logos, to Jesus. Now, again, this is not being, I'm not being submissive. I'm not being accountable to Jesus, some person that, Christians tell me that he is, and I'm not obeying his every whim. I'm obeying these standards. I'm aligning with these standards. I've decided that these standards are very important to me, and so I use these standards on myself. And then as a result, I ask people questions, and I do the same thing with them. Could you please be more clear about that? I wasn't really understanding. Boom, I just held you accountable, and it was pretty super easy, and it wasn't threatening at all. Hey, I didn't really understand what you're saying here. Could you please be a little more precise? Did you consider any other opinions other than this one? What about this and this and this? And what about this field of study? Do you think it adds to this conversation? Boom, all I'm doing is I'm holding you accountable in a way that isn't me holding you accountable. It's like it's Jesus flowing through me. Not Jesus in the literal sense, but Jesus in the metaphoric sense. Yeah, I understand that, Yernea. This is, I'm not a Christian. I grew up with it, but I understand, I actually converted to Judaism, and now I consider myself a Gnostic, and I see it as more of a psychological and a metaphoric thing. And the terminology can be very difficult for us because we keep trying to see it from this external perspective, but it's about internal stuff. It's about seeing Jesus as a metaphor for these objective standards, especially the divine logic of God, which is what created all the universe. And in fact, when you look at Greek teachings, a lot of the Greeks, especially like Aristotle and stuff like that, they talk about the Logos. And so this isn't just a Christian thing. This is actually a Greek thing as well. And also, in fact, it comes from the mythology of Egypt. So the land of Chem, which is where we get the word chemistry or alchemy. So the land of Chem is Egypt. And that's where all this comes from. So anybody have any questions on why it's okay to be accountable when it comes to objectivity and hold people accountable objectively, but why it's not okay to just try to hold people accountable arbitrarily? And also, we don't need to be held accountable arbitrarily. And if not, I'm going to actually talk about sovereignty next in regards to this type of accountability. Okay, so sovereignty, when you start really holding yourself to these intellectual standards, to these character traits, and you're processing your emotional upsets, you're working through, you're becoming more and more and more accountable to the objective, to the Logos. and you're becoming less and less, you're actually going to start becoming less and less accountable to arbitrary things. You're not going to be accountable to people when they say, well, you should do it, it's for the children, or you should do this, it's for, you know, respecting this person or respecting that person. No, we need to do it because it's either true or it's false. You know, if it's false, we need to not do it, and if it's true, we need to do it. But it's not based on this arbitrary thing. So when you're sovereign, that means that you're fully aligned with objective reality, and you are accountable fully to its rules and principles, and you are able to let that accountability flow through you so that you can hold others accountable in this manner. And it's not that you are holding them accountable, you're a vessel of accountability. But if it's arbitrary accountability, then they're like, well, you need to pay your taxes, or you need to, you know, submit, you know, the paperwork to get married because that's what you do. You know, this is an arbitrary thing. We don't have to, you know, submit paperwork to get married. I get married because this is my choice to do so. I don't need a piece of paper to tell me that I'm married or not married. I'm going to go to the ceremony because it's something I want to do, but not because I'm told to do it, or that, you know, some outside arbitrary thing tells me. And the more that we are aligned, then we can say no. We can say no to things. Well, no, I'm not doing that because I am a sovereign. I am only accountable to the objective. So a sovereign being, when you are fully sovereign, you are only accountable to the objective, and you have fully rid yourself of accountability to the arbitrary. Now, this isn't just something that happens overnight. You have to actually deconstruct your beliefs and reconstitute your beliefs into things that are more aligned with the objective. Otherwise, if it's just all this arbitrary stuff, you know, I could say all day long, I'm not going to pay taxes, but if you know, if my being state says, hey, I still believe in arbitrary accountability to some extent, and you're just resisting it, and now people are going to come to your house, they're going to arrest you, take you to jail, and you're going to go to jail because you didn't do something. And so don't think I'm telling you not to pay taxes. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that you have to have an aligned being state. You have to be aligned with it. But the more that you align yourself with objective accountability, the less you will be aligned with arbitrary things. And then because you're no longer susceptible to that, you are sovereign. Sovereign means you are a king, you are a queen. You are a self-ruler, and you do not rule over others. You are independent. You are now you are a Christ. You are aligned with the logos within yourself. Anyways, I think that is enough for today on arbitrary versus objective accountability. Oh, I do have one more thing. And that would be, how would I remove this belief? How would I deconstruct this belief? You'd say something like, even though I had this belief based on my childhood, and then you would give details, maybe tell stories. You know, I had to go to school. They gave me tests. They told me what was true and what was false. And I picked up this pattern of believing. Maybe, just maybe, that is completely arbitrary, and I no longer have to believe that anymore. Maybe, just maybe, I can start using objective standards instead, such as clarity, precision, you know, all the other relevance, depth, breadth, logic, fairness, whatever it might be. Maybe I can start using those standards instead of these arbitrary standards. Even though I learned from my parents, you know, that I had to submit to their whims, to submit to their arbitrary feelings and emotional patterns and beliefs. That was then, this is now. And maybe I can make a new choice. Maybe I can stop and realize that there's a difference between their arbitrary stuff and the truth. That's a possibility. I'm open to that. I'm open to a new way of relating, where I relate to the objective, and I'm accountable to people based on if it's true or not. And I can use questions to do that. I can question myself, I can question others, and I can do it in a way that is kind, aware, rational. And it doesn't have to be this emotionally charged thing. It's a possibility. I'm open to that. Okay, so Amber says, oh, this is deeper than obligation. It's how obligation was taught and learned. Yeah, it's a pattern. It's we're obligated. It's our responsibility, and now there are consequences to that responsibility, and that responsibility is being held accountable. So now you're being held accountable for your lack of responsibility to these arbitrary things, and then you get an F on your test, or you get a low score on your test because you were not accountable, or you didn't do well. So now the F is the punishment or the natural consequence of your lack of being accountable to this arbitrary thing. Or it's holding you accountable. It's holding you accountable for not being responsible. So when I'm responsible, I don't have to be held accountable. But actually, like in a regular conversation, so if you and I are having a conversation, Amber, and you share something with me, and I say, oh, can you give me an example of this? I'm holding you accountable there. I'm only holding you accountable because you didn't actually give an example. Now, should you have to give an example? Not necessarily. I mean, you shouldn't have to have thought of it beforehand. But it's just kind of like a conversation, and it evolves with us holding each other accountable in this process. So we're just kind of, it's a nice little tic-tac kind of a thing where I'm learning from you, you're learning from me, we're asking each other questions, we're holding each other accountable based on these subjective things. And as long as it stays objective, that's fine. But as soon as you start trying to enforce your beliefs upon me, or I start trying to enforce my beliefs upon you, separate from these objective questions that we ask ourselves to keep ourselves accountable, that's when there becomes a problem. Indeed, it is definitely nice when it happens. Thank you, Amber. I appreciate it. Good stuff, good stuff. Have a good one.
If you enjoyed this video, please click like. If you'd like to stay up to date with my videos, please subscribe. If you would like to be notified via email whenever I release a new video, please click the bell next to subscribe. If you have any comments or questions or would like to go into a dialogue about this topic, please leave them in the comments section below. I'm Nathan Martin with the Divine Pollination Hive and the UnityProcess.com. Be safe, be sovereign, be well.